This episode is brought to you by Mortgage Workflow Partners and the Mastering Encompass series, both for users as well as administrators. You can find out all the information about it over at masteringencompass.com. Also, if you'd like to check out what we're doing on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to the channel using the @MasteringEncompass handle. And make sure you stay up to date on all the information, not just with podcasts, but also video content that we bring to you as often as possible. Now let's get on to the episode. Welcome, everyone. My name is Larry Bailey. It is Tuesday, August 26th, 2025. Thanks for coming. Today is another Mastering Encompass workshop. It's part of our 12-part series workshop. We're going to kick off here in a moment. We're still going to be inviting a few people in before we get totally started. Hopefully everybody's having a productive month. Thanks for coming. A couple of ground rules just to keep things in mind. Please use the chat or the Q&A feature here in the Teams meeting. That'll keep me on track. If you have a question, use the raise hand feature. That's usually how I spot you better. And we can take you off mic. Feel free to share. It is a community meeting, so I always encourage discussion. Don't always get it, but that's okay. I know everybody's shy. Everybody likes to live on camera like me. But this is part of our 12-part series. So today is all about Underwriting Unlocked, best practices for file flow. Last week, we talked about processing power with pre-underwriting workflow secrets. Hopefully that made a lot of sense for you. And we'll, let's see, we're a couple minutes in. So I wanted to talk about, well, again, before we get jumping in, obviously, since last we met, we had a huge email update from ICE Mortgage Technology with regards to the SDK transition sunset, changing from October 31st, 2025 to December 31st, 2026. And there's a lot of speculation as to why, blah, blah, blah. I'm not really interested in that. What I'm more interested in is that everybody needs to keep their foot on the gas with making sure that your service providers are converted to EPC entirely, because that's the only way you get your data workflows. It's the way you make this whole thing work, is making sure your EPC vendors are on full API. Earlier today on the admin call, there was a question that said, hey, I'm using such and such POS, and they're telling me they're on full API, but I can't use workflow rules to do one-click automation or one-click disclosure, disclosure automation, or one-click document requests, or true workflow rules, lights out document requests. To which I said, well, maybe they're not on full API like they're saying. Don't know. So check with your provider, see where it's going. But remember, it's if your service provider is saying they're on EP, because that's where they are, but you can't fully leverage all of workflow rules, automation, do some investigation, see where that lands for you. So that came out. Also, what happened today earlier is ICE put on sale, this is crazy, but ICE put on sale its exhibitor booths for Experience 2026. I don't know if they did that today because it's 26th, but in any event, it went on sale for anybody who was an exhibitor last year. Mortgage Workflow Partners are going to be there. We got a full 10 by 20 booth. We're going to have part of it's going to be like the sales part. The other part's going to be learning center, learning zone. We're still figuring that out. But keep on the lookout. If you're going to ICE, we'd love to see you there. If you're not going to ICE, figure it out. Got to get there. Get your team to invest in it, mostly because of the training that's available pre-conference. There's a lot of folks who take that, which they get value out of. We're going to have workshop demonstrations during conference, and then we've got the full after the conference. We've got an entire workflow before technology symposium for the day. We're focusing in on we're used to calling it the wrap-up show for ICE X26, or ICEX, whatever, this year. This one coming up is 26. But we're going to be splitting that up into teaching you not only all the cool stuff that you should be following up with, the things that are being announced at the show, plus the things you should have already known. But then also we're going to be having a component, Christy Unger, who's our workflow documentation specialist. Hey, Christy, she's going to be there too with her with her skill sets to teach you all about workflow reviews and things that she's learned. It's going to be a super day if you can attend. If you're part of the Mortgage Collaborative, that's going to cost you $250. If you're current at the time, you're current with your admin subscription, it's going to cost you $250. And if you're not either of those, it's going to cost you $500. That's it. And that's going to be the deal. So definitely RSVP for that. Any questions, let me know. I think it still says $750. We're going to change that to $500. And if you're one of those two groups and you need a coupon code for the 50% off, let me know. All right. We have everybody here. Let's get into this topic for today. Underwriting Unlocked. So I'm trying to get better by creating presentations. And so here we go. We'll see how this goes today. And by the way, if anybody's going to be in Boston for the Mortgage Collaborative, please look me up. I'm doing a 6-minute series at the Boston show, and we're talking a lot about how to leverage native settings in Encompass. So hopefully you'll see you there. Today's is all about mastering mortgage lifecycle, of course. This is our 12-part series, and today's all about underwriting. And so when we talk about underwriting, and again, this is all built around my 12-part workshop series, which is my magical company that doesn't exist. And the idea here is that we get to underwriting, and the philosophy of the workflow before technology, it doesn't stop at certain departments. It's the entire workflow. And so when I talk about underwriting, I want to have my borrowers know that they're going to get the loan that they're applying for as soon as possible and repetitively. And so there's a lot of folks that think like a retail lender traditionally would think of, and there's this compartmentalization of the workflow from sales to processing to services, and then it goes to the underwriter. And then we figure out what's going on. For anybody that does TPO business, you know that's not a thing, right? We know that we want to find out really quick, preferably immediately, maybe even before I give you the file, is my borrower going to qualify? Am I going to be able to close this loan? And I want to find that out as early as possible, because I don't want, as a mortgage company, I don't want to spend my resources having my team work on a file that we can't get closed. It just makes sense. And so we try to solve for this in a few different ways. Role of underwriting. Guys, underwriting is not AI. So when companies are out there talking about like AI underwriting or AI engine, right? You can even look at AUS. Like when you go to Fannie and Freddie, when you go to LPA or you go to DU, I know we've talked about it over the years as a black box because we can't see inside it, but gang, I hate to tell you this, but there's no magic here. The reality is these are rules that are set up to be evaluated based upon the data being fed into the evaluation. We're not projecting some interpretation of this. We're not forecasting some statistical analysis of what the borrower's ability to be able to repay that loan is. It's a mathematical calculation. Either the borrower has sufficient ability to repay the loan or they don't, or there's a sufficient documentation in the file to support their ability to repay, or there isn't. And so when we think about underwriting, for those, if we leave mortgage for a second, if we talk about insurance, right, whether it's life or property, or title, the underwriter of that file is really focusing in on, does this meet my guidelines? And if so, what do I do about it? And so when we talk about underwriting in this workshop, I want you to be pragmatic about what your underwriter is doing. They are evaluating the data that's being presented to them. And don't be confused. A document is nothing more than data. So when we look at a pay stub, it's the data. When we look at bank statements, it's the data. And so if you buy into that argument that we're really just reviewing the data, and we know that underwriting is nothing more than a set of rules, how quickly can you have the data evaluated in your file to determine the underwriting outcome? How quickly can you pivot your workflow so that as soon as that data is present in the file, we can make at least a partial underwriting decision on that loan? Okay. And so the idea is, I don't know if that dinging is coming through, but I forgot to turn it off. Sorry if that's been going on in your ear. My apologies. So the idea here is that if you're buying into what I'm trying to sell you here, which is to say underwriting is not a black box. We know what your guidelines are. We know what we have to do in the file to close that loan and to sell that loan and to make money. We have this idea of when do we want the underwriting evaluation to happen. Obviously, we want it to happen always, which is pre-underwriter person at the underwriter person's desk and then post-underwriter person. And then, of course, the real objective here is to reduce the risk of that process and to make sure that we have the best possible workflow alignment to get to the end game, which is selling that loan or boarding that loan and getting paid. Right? We work to get paid. We work to make sure. Now, there's a huge benefit, obviously. We have real people with real homes. Don't mistake what I'm trying to say. But the idea is that we've got to make sure that this is documented really well. So if we go over into some pre-underwriting. Pre-underwriting means the file was created and it's not yet at the underwriter's desk. That's pre-underwriting. Again, most people, if you ask this question, raise your hands. Tell me if you think when I said pre-underwriting, you were thinking the processor. Show of hands. Who thinks just the processor? Right? Fair amount. Appreciate you guys playing along with me. But what if I told you pre-underwriting was from the file creation? It's kind of different, right? And so, because I'm just a weirdo the way I think, but pre-underwriting means every moment in time before the underwriter hits that file, I want to check how ready is that file for the underwriter to receive. One of the things I talk about is, and this is not to be derogatory, I was an underwriter, so maybe that means I can make fun of myself a little bit here, but as an underwriter, the more you make me think, the less likely you're going to get it clear to close. The more you make me think, I'm going to go looking for other stuff that maybe I don't really need to find. So is the file ready for that underwriter? Another question that comes up is processor underwriter, right? For those that raised hands or weren't quick enough to raise your hands, but you were thinking that you do agree that when I say pre-underwriting, you think processor. What's a transaction between processor and underwriter? Is it a processor finishing a milestone, which causes the underwriter to say, oh, it's time to go to work? Or is it happening asynchronously? So again, I'm going to embellish here on a retail versus non-retail situation, right? Retail is traditionally goes to sales, to disclosure desk, to processor, then to underwriter. It's like these hard lines. It's almost like we're working on paper still. It's like I have this book, right? This is my file, and there's only one of them, so I can't do anything. But what if I were to conceptually tear this apart into individual pages, and I was able to work on each of these individual pages at different desks at the same time, and then coalesce them or conjoin them back together at the time of whatever time it's appropriate to create one cohesive file? We as an industry have got to, and if you look at your workflow, I promise you've got, if not most, at least more than some of your people still acting like they're working on paper. How do I know this? Because you're not working asynchronously. And in Encompass, eventually, I think we're going to finally get publicly able to work in files at the same time, because we're all not working on the same things at the same time. We're working on different things. Think about pieces of paper. There's only one piece of paper. You're working on that one. I'm working on this one. Different levels of data. We can join them at the end and we get a clear to close much, much quicker because we're working asynchronously. So this handoff here, it's not about a handoff, it's about a collaborative effort to clear that file for close. And so again, I'm gonna paint you two distinct pictures. Traditional workflows are binary. You have it, I have it. You have it, I have it. And that's not the best practice workflow if you can help it. Your best practice workflow is you're working on something while I'm working on something, then you're working on something, then I'm working on something, and it's happening at the same moment. It's like a DNA strand. It's very intertwined. So the idea here is, how do we get through automation and checklists? Well, checklists, I put this on here because it's what everybody's used to. If I put on here workflow tasks, you're going to say, well, we're not using workflow tasks. But you are using checklists. And the automation is about, when does your underwriter know that they're supposed to go working on something? Again, I'm going to continually use wholesale and TPO because that's where I find the most efficiency, because your margins are thin, so people have to move fast. But the automation is when a file comes in for a document, depending on what it is, if you have that tied to a condition, you can use a workflow rule to automatically mark the condition status as fulfilled, lights out. Think about like your flood cert comes in. Think about like your appraisal comes in. Maybe your title comes in. Could be anything, right? If it's very specific, maybe it's a letter of explanation from a borrower that you automatically requested and they automatically sent back. Right? These are all real life examples, gang. This is not pie in the sky future land. This is now. You can be doing this right now. And so when do you let your underwriters touch that? That depends on your workflow. Red flags to eliminate early. This one's super important. As soon as something comes in that causes the file to no longer be eligible for the loan that it's going to, why do you have to wait for an underwriter to figure that out? Gang, we know DTI standards, LTV standards, credit score standards, assets after closing for reserve standards. We know that if the seller comes back and you're dealing with a title vendor that has integrations with EPC, and they bring the seller information into your file contacts and it doesn't match the seller information that's also there, there's something you can do with that, right? Maybe you're leveraging a third party like Alpha 7X that does comparisons between your loan file and your e-folder and your public records. Red flags early and often. So there's an old saying, you want to fail early and often, right? And the reason why you want to fail early and often in experimentation is because you want to know when you are not failing. And you want to do it early so you don't waste resources to get to that fail. It's the same thing in underwriting. I want to know when I'm going to have this problem. Quite honestly, sales is your first underwriter or pre-underwriter in that loan. They're the ones looking typically at credit reports. They're the ones quoting deals. And so if your deal doesn't make it through your product and pricing engine, stop. That's one of those examples. Just making sense? Anyone have any questions? I'm looking at chat, not seeing anybody chatting. So if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks, everybody. There's 47 some odd people on here. So thanks for coming to this one. I thought this might be important for you. So now let's talk about underwriting. All right, let's get into the underwriting flow. And this is important because if you can't figure out how to manage your underwriter's time and work, you're losing money. Your company is spending resources that are unnecessarily spent. Traditionally, underwriters are the highest paid part of the workflow. There might be fewer, so there might be the overall GL, side. GL side might be less than all your processors put together, but by person, they're typically the most compensated, most highly compensated. So you want to keep their workflows very clear. You want to make sure everything is tight. And so, a triage model for underwriting. I went over this earlier with somebody this month. It was a client, and they wanted to use workflow tasks to give clear definitions of which files or underwriters wanted to work on next. Notice what I didn't say. I didn't say round robin. What we talked about is Larry, the underwriters, got a series of loans to be underwritten today. Some of them are resubs, some of them are resubs for CTCs or some conditions. Maybe some are purchases, maybe some are refis that are expiring this month, maybe they're expiring next month. How do you really expect your team to understand what they're supposed to do? You have to be able to segment by complexity, and complexity can be interpreted to be urgency, right? And so what we did with this particular example was I turned it into a model that says, hey, listen, we're gonna set the level of urgency to be the highest if it's a CTC purchase closing this month. And you can change the urgency of the workflow tasks by conditions within Encompass settings, right? Web settings. If you didn't know that, you should know that. If I can train you, join the Mastering Encompass course. I'll train you how to do all this stuff. Clear communication channels. That doesn't mean email, gang. Definitely not email. The idea of communication on this is what needs to be happening by when. This doesn't mean I need to tell you. It means that we need to have good, effective communication on the file where it's easy to find regardless of who you are. So a lot of times I'll propose a notes page, which has multiple panels, and I put an example of this in the community of how to do it. So basically it creates a log, and you can segment out who can access the log based upon personas with native input form builder. And you can do this in desktop or web. But the idea is everybody can find the exact same information at the exact same place in one place to look. That's clear. And by the way, if you're leveraging enhanced conditions, there's a nice UI change with enhanced conditions that puts the chat of the condition smack in the center of your face. You can't miss it. Versus on standard conditions where it's hidden behind that left tab that nobody ever goes to. And so the idea is clearly, where do you put this communication for what's happening in that underwriting flow? You've got turn times and metrics and service level agreements, SLAs. This gets back into the prioritization up in here of segmentation of triaging that underwriting file. And the good news is you can actually track a lot of this, especially if you're using Data Connect. But if you've got your own data warehouse, you can track all these new objects within that data warehouse so you can see exactly what's going on. You know, did we meet our turn times and SLAs? If not, why not? Let's figure it out. And then, of course, what I want you to rely upon mostly is Encompass native features. By the way, everything I've talked about in here and throughout all the 12-part workshop series, 0 plugins, gang, all native. I did a post earlier on LinkedIn today where, you know, I was kind of taking a snipe to vendors by saying, you know, vendors love to sell you widgets. We love to prove you don't need them. It's true. That's why I created Mortgage Workflow Partners, was to prove that, which we continue to do. And so you can leverage this workflow optimization through condition templates. Again, hopefully you're using enhanced conditions, so that's easily done. You can also use workflow tasks to manage the conditions that be added or waived, because you don't delete conditions. They exist there for a reason based upon that moment. But if that data changes, then you waive those conditions or you add them back if those conditions return. You know, the situation on the file returns. Task-based workflows, I'm always going to encourage you to get to an exception-based, task-based workflow. In English, that means think about your checklist, like we talked about a slide ago. Remember that if that entire checklist is finished, there's no more tasks, right? But if there's something unfinished, that's an exception. I know you might be thinking exception like I need someone's exception authority. An exception in software is more of there's something missing. And so that's what I'm talking about. In other words, I only want my team working on things that are not yet done. I don't want them physically managing tasks to say they got it done. If that work's done, there's nothing for them to do. And then, of course, everything is based on personas. And gangs, I'm telling you right now, I've been saying this forever. Multiple persona syndrome is a real thing. You should have one persona per user account. If you need help figuring that out, let me know. It's very important. Even more so, again, when we get into task-based workflows, conditions are managed by role. in enhanced condition, it's the task, the condition, enhanced condition types are managed by role, but tasks are managed by personas. So if you've got multiple personas assigned to a user account and you want to have segregation of how that task is to be managed, you might be in for some extra work. Keep that in mind, please. Okay, went through underwriting. Now, post-underwriting is not post-closing. Post-underwriting is post the person that put their name on the dotted line and said, yeah, this loan so far meets conditions, more to come. And so how do you manage those conditions? Now, there's an ongoing theory. This will be a good opportunity for the group here. Wait, there's a chat that I missed. Oh, yes, very important, Mark Sailors. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask you for a show of hands for a poll. Ready? So here's the poll. Show of hands for who thinks 2 months most recent bank statements is a condition. Who thinks that's a condition? Raise your hands real quick. 2 months most recent bank statements. Archie says, I got one person. Okay, 2. I thought, Archie, you're going to be by yourself. All right, 3, fine, 4. All right, next one. Go ahead, put your hands down. Who thinks 2 months most recent bank statements is a workflow task? Okay, we got 2, we got 10. Okay. All right. Interesting concept, right? All right, thanks everybody for playing along. Appreciate that. So the idea is, I think companies are going to start to reevaluate what's a condition versus what's a task. I really do. I know I've started doing that in workflow reviews and workflow rollouts, and especially when we're moving to enhanced condition workflows in the clients that we support, because 2 months most recent bank statements is absolutely, in my mind, a task. What are we looking for? We're looking to validate that the income meets the guidelines, specifically with what? With DTI. Okay. Potentially, depending on the loan type, it could also be for residual income, right? That's another way to look at it. But the idea is borrower to support their income of X. Archie's like, both can be true, I suppose. And I agree with you, Archie. It can be both, but should it be both? I think the intent here is we need to validate sufficient income to qualify. That's the condition. The task is bank statements, pay stubs, tax returns, all 3 distinct ways to document income. Right? So how do we deal with that? How do we move the needle on what those things are? Are they conditions or tasks? You got to figure it out with your workflow. And then what is a resubmission? This gets back to a couple of slides ago where I said, well, maybe I want conditions to be managed asynchronously with processing. Like, is there even a submission? Well, what if it's been seen by the underwriter, and what does resubmission mean? I think what we're looking for is a way to define when is the underwriter supposed to review conditions. That's what historically we had paper. We had to resubmit because we had a single book of paper. But now if I've got a page and the page happens to be a condition and that's fulfilled, is it a resubmission if the underwriter just sees a list of fulfilled conditions that they need to review? It's kind of interesting, right? So do you need a resubmission milestone? Do you need a resubmission workflow, or is your resubmission just a series of fulfilled conditions? What does that look like? Something else that's important is the escalation, right? Let's say there is a moment where we've got a conflict between an underwriter's interpretation of information and what the other team members believe should be happening. What happens with that escalation? How do we post it out? This is a great example of a workflow task, leveraging a role that's filled by a user group, because you could have multiple people within that escalation path. Maybe it's not a persona that's part of that role. Maybe it's a user group of people that need to give an escalation review for whatever's going on. I don't know. But it gives you an opportunity within that workflow task to identify who's responsible for that task's completion. Maybe you've got an appraisal escalation path. Maybe you've got a title review escalation path or an income review escalation path. You get it. But by leveraging workflow tasks and how those roles are assigned, you can go through and now develop your own path without any email whatsoever. Which comes into my last point on here on post underwriting flow, which is reporting and transparency. Traditionally, you're going to lean on pipeline views, dashboards, reports, and email, not to mention the occasional walk to somebody's office if you have that kind of a situation. And that's all okay, but the reality is none of this is actually necessary. The reporting and transparency is actually unnecessary if you've been documenting everything all along. The escalation path is definitely cool, but all along you've been documenting the status of those conditions and document history in the history tab of the e-folder that you can see anytime you need to. Do you need to document every single field in the file? I've gotten this request so many times on, especially on new implementations, when you're coming from when the client's coming from a POS, an LOS that is outside of Encompass, and they're used to like database formatted LOSs. And they're like, well, we're used to having everything audited and reported. To which I would say, if that's the level of what you want Data Connect, or you want a data warehouse that has API set up to go fetch anytime there's a loan change. Whatever it is that's important to you, I can tell you that historically speaking, if you're leveraging what we're talking about, the transparency is already in the file. There's nothing more to do. It's just there. If I can get there it goes. All right. So let's talk about some common pitfalls. You guys are still hanging in there with me? Excellent. Thank you. So submitting incomplete files. Does anybody use, by the way, again, show of hands if you would, please. Does anybody use a readiness workflow? So in the past, like a couple of events ago, I showed you on screen like the disclosure readiness. So is anybody actually using something that constructively notifies your team member that the file is no longer incomplete? Or are you using business rules that tell your user when they've tried to submit and they fail? Good example of this is milestone completion business rules, right? And so we end up, as admins, we end up chasing our tails on, oh my God, can you believe Larry submitted another file of such and such without this document or data point? Can you please update the business rules so they don't make that same mistake again? Or what if we created a dynamic display on screen that's done through field calc so everybody on this call can do it? If you're an average admin, I know you can figure out a field calc that says if loan program field 1401 equals whatever, that all these things are required. Document dot receive date dot whatever, or field ID XYZ. Okay. Yeah, Gabe, sorry, high pressure. Candace, for FDE rules, remember field data entry has to do with I'm sorry, you're going to convert love it. Yeah. Everybody give thumbs up to Candace. Basically, she's going to take the FDE rule and convert that into the readiness. And I'm going to encourage you to really explore that idea of a readiness screen, because people don't want to know when they're wrong. They want to know when they're right. And they're going to keep working till they see it's correct. And it's a crazy mind bend. It's a Jedi mind trick to have people do the same work, but they're actually working towards a yes. They're not waiting for a no. Carrie Klaus, the review screen I'm talking about, go back and look for disclosure readiness. Look in the community for disclosure readiness. If you can't find it after that, let me know directly. I'll point you to it. Cool. We use this for disclosure ready screen, similar thing. Yeah, excellent, Denise. Way to go. So that's number one, common pitfalls. Number two, over customizing Encompass. So we've had Encompass for a while. We've had the ability to create these insane custom input forms that nobody can figure out what to do. You're in that camp because when you hire somebody new, it takes a long time to train them how to use your Encompass, even if they've been using Encompass for a little while. Also, if you're using plugins, whether you created them or you bought them from a third party or you're leasing them from a third party, all of these things go back to doing your workflow review first. Again, in today's admin course, the goal was for everybody to produce a single department workflow review. Most are still working on that, but I showed everybody today exactly what it looks like when you've done that. You've created an optimal workflow, and everything we did, all the automation we did, was all native, not a single plugin, and that's really important. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use a plugin, like plugins to do automatic payment of FHA MIP, or automation to do a plugin to do automatic TOS TOB in MERS. These are still required if you're at that level of need, but you don't need a plugin to move a loan from one folder to another. You don't need a plugin to automatically send an email to a borrower with an attachment. Just craziness. Candace, thanks for the plug on that. Yeah, I showed Candace the code behind the one field, and she's off to the races. So go get him, Candace. Candace, excuse me. I've got Kansas on the brain, obviously. Third one, missing loan manufacturing checklist. So pitfall here is checklist. Again, I'm going to tell you that it's a workflow. I put checklist in there just because everybody's used to checklists. So how you get that loan manufactured is what I'm talking about. I want you to really think about, how do we go from lead through post-closing, line by line, step by step. If that's too much, start easy. And what I'm going to encourage you to do is start with post-closing and work backwards. It's crazy, but it's a lot easier to work backwards on these jobs than it is to work forwards, mostly because you can see what people are doing instead of guessing what people are doing. If I'm going from left to right, right to left. So figure it out, document it, make sure you got everything figured out in your workflow, because if you don't do that, a lot of this work is very, very hard. Fourth one, conditions tracked outside LOS. Conditions can be substituted with data, can be substituted with just basic information. So if you are leveraging anything outside of Encompass for documenting status, requests, communication, updates, I've got people using Trello, Google Sheets, Excel, Smart Sheets, handwritten notes. I found somebody today who was still keeping borrowers' papers inside a folder in their desk drawer, just in case somebody loses it in Encompass. I kid you not. It's 2025, and they're still hanging on the paper. So you have to know your workflow to see this stuff going on. So real world wins. Truth statements. Lender cut UW turn times via pre-UW checklist. So the idea here is that, again, I want you to substitute checklist for what we've already talked about this multiple times. I'm going to tell you that when we looked at this, what we're really talking about is feeding underwriting conditions or pre-approval conditions. Because what we're able to do is to show team members on the sales and the processing teams exactly what's going to be required based upon the data that's in the loan. What we found is that people really didn't realize what they were putting in the loan file and how it affected the submission. So some good examples are that the system was asking for information or citing red flags. And they were like, oh, no, it's just like nonsense information. Like, I didn't realize that was going on. And they go and fix it. And all of a sudden we have a cleaner file. What also happens is when it goes into underwriting, because the information is already in the system in a way that makes sense to an underwriter, they do what? Like I talked about in the very beginning, they let the underwriter think less. More files flow. It's an easier day for the underwriter. They can produce more loans. Everybody's happy. Also, condition templates. Again, if you're using standard conditions, using condition templates for that can help. Preferably, if you're using enhanced conditions, you're using workflow rules to determine what is supposed to be there at that moment or what's supposed to be waived when things change. Remember, you're never deleting, ever. You're just waiving. And then lastly, this better communications loop, lowered underwriting touches. So this had to do with underwriters emailing processors who were emailing loan officers asking about something in the file because the underwriter didn't want to suspend the loan or deny the loan. And so what we figured out was that there was a breakdown between what the borrower told the LO told the processor, like a traditional telephone game. And what happened was, because the loan officer is not in the file the same way the processor is, there was a disconnect for what actually got put into the loan. And so when we closed that loop and we actually showed the loan officer how to easily understand what the open conditions were on the file based upon the data in the file, files that went to underwriting were cleaner and more correct for what the scenario was, and it reduced underwriting touches, which means everything flows better. Some of the things that are not on here, because I didn't want to beat you over the head based upon the time that I had, but I have a couple of minutes here. Some of the things also that are a part of this is borrower satisfaction. So some companies are really particular about what they share with borrowers in terms of open conditions. Others are just flat out open, and they're like, here's a list of open conditions. And what we found was that borrowers knowing what was going on reduced the number of times they had to contact somebody at the company to ask what was going on. And it also reduced, this is even more interesting, it also reduced the amount of nonsense in files, because when the LO was building that loan and conditions were being automatically created with enhanced conditions, there was no more about a negotiation between the loan officer or the salesperson and the borrower. It was very clear what the guidelines were, because those are the conditions added into the loan file automatically. And so now we were able to bring in files that already knew, the salesperson knew and the borrower knew. There wasn't a waiting period between sales and underwriting to figure out if what was sent in would be helpful or even needed. It was very clear from the automation of the underwriting workflow. Gabe got out. So sorry, Gabe, I just noticed you were out. So Gabe's back in. Okay. Sorry, Gabe. Didn't know you were out. All right. Some takeaways here. We talked about file readiness. Sorry, Gabe, I didn't see it. My bad. We talked about file readiness. It's not just for disclosures, gang. It is all along the way. Is the file ready for disclosures? Is the file ready for underwriting? Is the file ready for closing? Is the file ready for funding? A lot of times in workflow reviews and workflow updates, I'll talk a lot about comparison forms. So typically I'll do 3 comparison forms, so that one's for underwriting, one's for secondary, one's for closing. And so that is, once the file leaves that party and the loan changes in some measurable way, we can determine if we need that party to go back and review it before docs or before funding or whatever. This is the other angle. This is all about making sure that we know that the file is ready for that moment before it gets there. Does anybody use again, keep you involved in here. Does anybody use preview for Mavent before you send disclosures? At least 1 out of 48, that's pretty good. So 10, 13, all right. Thanks for playing along. So remember that file readiness, when you're ready to disclose, you've got this cool thing called Mavent, and you've got this cool button called Preview, and that's making sure that Mavent reviews the file for any potential regulatory or compliance issues on that file before you disclose. So if you know that the file's ready for underwriting before you send it to the underwriter, dude, that's a good day. You know what? And if it gets wrong, to Candace's point, you can update this simple little field calc to make sure that under that scenario, we check for readiness on the next file. And because it's a field calc, it's always running. always. Next bullet, leveraging native automation first. So obviously October 31, 2025 is no longer a deadline for SDK tech, but that doesn't mean that doesn't stop your focus on leveraging native automation first. I'm going to empower you to keep looking for ways to leverage native automation, because you're going to develop your workflow reviews and you're going to figure out that third-party tech is no longer absolutely necessary if you just look at your workflow and how people are working. It's a big deal. And for those that have ever seen, I did a post on LinkedIn earlier this year where I put up Mortgage Workflow Partners Encompass on a recording. It was like a 1.5-minute recording. And I just flew through Encompass desktop, and everybody's like, "What did you speed it up?" And I intentionally kept talking through it so you could hopefully understand that I was not speeding up the video. It's just because I didn't have any plugins. That's it. That's the difference. So, food for thought. Third bullet, aligning processors, underwriters, and closers. Again, what I want you to take away from today is this is not a stop go. This is a pattern of workflow that allows everybody to asynchronously work together. There is no reason why a closer has to wait for a clear to close before they start working on the file. Nor should you want them, especially if they're the ones that are reviewing title. There's nothing to do with vetting an ICD or a COCCD with final fees for a closer, a title agent or an attorney. Like, a closer can pull that together anytime. Just like even for processors working before it gets to underwriting, all this stuff works together. And so your job is to figure out your best practice workflow. Again, if you need any help with that, let Mortgage Workflow Partners know. And then using governance to measure and adjust. Guys, I talk about this a lot in my normal presentations, my live presentations. If you don't benchmark what you're doing, when you make the change, you'll have no concept of if you're actually improving. And so the idea is that when you go through, make sure you're documenting what you're doing, you document why you need to adjust, and then measure the difference, whether it's in touch count, time count, satisfaction, money. Those are all important measurements, obviously. So, but you gotta document it. So in chat, or if you want to raise your hand on any questions, I'd love to know, if you don't mind sharing with me, your biggest underwriting file flow challenge. We've got a few more minutes here, so if you've got a challenge, you want to either type it, or if you feel like you want to come up on audio and or video, let me know. Or you can answer the question of, where do you see the most rework? I'd love to get your feedback on what this is. So Rachel says program changes. Yeah, needing a re-underwrite, right? So that's a big challenge. And one of the things, Rachel, that I'm imagining you're coming across is when you're going from conventional to FHA, which a lot of companies don't even allow because of initial disclosures, but some use a COC for the MI. But how do we know what we had, and how does the underwriter go back through? Well, the idea would be you'd have to establish what those underwriting guides are, and how do you have your conditions configured? What do you have as a file as far as conditions? And then what do you have as FHA specific? Right? That's a big question that if you're having that challenge, it might make an opportunity to visit that. Danielle says file's not ready at first look. That gets back to readiness. Right? I've seen plenty of files, as I'm sure you have, Danielle, where somebody's like, I got to have this loan underwritten. And then the underwriter gets it. And it's like, what the hell? I can't underwrite this thing. Amanda, construction of perm loans. We have a very large CTP lender as a client. And depending on what your flow is for CTP, that can be a lot of underwriting challenge, especially as information may not be really well documented in there in terms of how they're qualifying, if they have their land, how are they doing that, where's the money coming from, how the soft costs included in that calculation. So I definitely understand what I probably feel like you're thinking, Amanda, so thanks for sharing that one. Kristen says non-QM programs, teams struggle with reviewing the right guidelines for the specific product. So you have the ability within Workflow Engine to make sure that they have the right conditions. Now, let's say you're like, Larry, we're not ready for enhanced. That's too big of a lift. Guys, you have workflow tasks that you can spell out. So if they're struggling, Kristen, so call to action for you in this particular thing of a situation is you can spell out that says if 1401 gets changed to this, fire off a list of a workflow task parent for that particular program with all the things that you want them to remember to do. That's your variable checklist. We had a project where a lender was moving from desktop. They wanted to move to web, and that admin for that lender had gone through a crazy amount of effort to code 1,600 some odd lines into their custom desktop input form builder form, and it dynamically made things appear and disappear and whatever. And so he's like, oh, we have to convert that to JavaScript. And I'm like, no, we're not doing that. We're going to turn that into a parent workflow task with subtasks that fire based upon the conditions that you believe need to be true. So those 1,600 lines turned into a single workflow task with 199 subtasks. That's actual number, 199. Was it a lot of work? Yeah, it took us 4 months. Guess what? Everyone is super excited about using it. And guess what else? It works on desktop or web. Doesn't matter because it's a workflow task. Now, we did put nice little cool task workspaces for web when they get there so the teams can actually see what they're trying to do in those subtasks. But ideally, that's what I would encourage you to do, Kristen, with that as well as everybody else. So see how that goes. Candace says, I'm trying to convince here that we don't need to reproduce our current bar summary form. Yeah, I would say what I would encourage you to do, Candace, as well as anybody else on this topic, is look at what fields every file needs for everyone. That's actually what you need. As far as quickly entering loan information for loan officers, I'd encourage you using Encompass Web with card-based views, obviously. But for everybody else, the reality is each person needs their own little part of what they need to focus on. Most of the time, the reason why you build these summary forms in desktop is because it's too hard to click around the different input forms to find the piece that you need. And this is why I always encourage you to use, to at least seriously consider leveraging web for card-based views, because you can compartmentalize what you want to show them and you can dynamically make that card appear or not appear based on very, very basic scripting. So definitely don't want to do that, Candace. If you want to talk about it more, start the thread in the community. We'll talk about it, or hunt me down at ICE and I'll show you what to do if it lasts that long. Don't know what booth number we have yet, but it's going to be a cool conference, and I hope to see you there. And obviously at the rest of our workshop series here every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern. And I think that's the end of it. So thank you. Hopefully it was a little bit more organized today with slide deck and more of a presentation than anything else. So hopefully today was worth it for you. We're here for another few minutes. Anybody have any more questions, thoughts? If you want to come off mute and you want to ask something, because that's much easier than typing, let me know. But otherwise, if you've gotten your saturation of Larry talk today, feel free to drop off. Rachel says, best way to get started with workflow tasks. Rachel, the easiest way I'm going to tell you is post-closing. The reason why is because post-closing is nothing but tasks. They're chasing things. And so you want to start there, because instead of them having to maintain their spreadsheets or their fields, or whatever they're doing to track their work today, create a workflow task that says need final title. Another one says need recorded mortgage, and have them start with that. Once you get that down and you understand how to best manage it, my next suggestion is to tell you to go to actual either processing or sales, depending on your team, and get them out of handwritten notes or get them out of their Excel sheet, or get them out of their Outlook reminders and have them put those reminders in workflow tasks. Mark, I'm going to bring it up on screen here 1 second. The one called Disclosure Ready. So we're going to go over to Mastering Encompass. Let's see if we can find it. Oh, Candace said that. Thanks, Candace. So we go up to search, and we're going to do Disclosure Ready. And we're going to search comments, posts, and more. I clicked on something bad. Sorry, guys. Let's try that again. There it goes. So we talk about this. So I would say it's probably in here, because that's a replay of what I talked about. It was part 4, and so it's in here. So Mark, I will put this link to that in the chat here, and you'll find it in there. Keep in mind, guys, if you ever come in here, right, let's go check it out. If you go and you expand this out, that's not what I want to do. Click play first. Okay, and that'll start this guy, and then you don't hear me talk. And now I want to expand this part. One of these lets me do the comments. Hang on. Oh, show transcript. I'll get my act together. Show transcript, and then expand out the transcript. And then you can talk about disclosure ready. If you click that, it'll actually fast forward to it. So check that out, Mark. See if that helps. I obviously can't get my mouse to click. That's the way it works. So hopefully that makes sense. Any other questions? I think that's a wrap. Thanks, gang, for coming. See you in 2 weeks. I'm going off to Hawaii for a week's vacation next week. So aloha to you. Enjoy. See you soon. Thanks. See you. Bye-bye. Thank you, Kansas. Kansas. I don't know why I keep saying like, thank you, Candace. Thanks, Amanda.